Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. Before we get into our story tonight, I'm excited to tell you about something that I've been working on for quite some time. Something that we created just for you, to bring a piece of the Village of Nothing Much into your homes and guide you into healthy wind-down routines that will feel so good. This month we are releasing the Nothing Much Happens Wind-Down Box, a wellness box of hand-selected products that I personally use and that I love, along with a few exclusive stories to round out your cozy routines. Each box features products specially selected for your relaxation. From Everesio Wellness's Chill Now, a high-potency, organic-certified reishi mushroom extract, to NutriChamp's Tart Cherry Gummies, great for sleep and reducing inflammation, and they taste great. Then there's a lavender candle to mark your moment of calm and wind down from our favorite small batch candle makers, Vela Box. A meditative activity for you by way of a Brighter Years mini coloring book. They're a fantastic way to disconnect from your screen and tap into your creative self before bed. There are more mushrooms, this time in chocolate, specially formulated for sleep from the lovely team behind Alice Mushrooms. Delicious essential oils that were made to be rubbed on your wrists and neck from our friends at Woolsey's, and of course some melatonin for those who need an extra helping hand to rest. By way of new strips, you just place it on your tongue and it dissolves in seconds. Like everything in this village, we took our time to create this for you. It is such a pleasure to be able to help so many of you with my stories, and I'm excited to continue to create new ways, new forms of comfort with our first ever wind down box. Head over to nothingmuchhappens.com for more information. For years I looked for stories to relax to, tales to soothe me after a day out in the world, to remind me of good things and kind people and help me feel grounded and connected. After a while, I realized I might just need to write them myself, and that is how my sleep podcast, Nothing Much Happens, came to be. I wrote and told stories to help folks settle in and sleep, but after a while, I heard from lots of listeners that while they were grateful to finally be sleeping so well, they dropped off within a few moments of hearing my voice, and they were sad not to be able to hear the actual story. And I think in the world we're living in, we probably need all the tools we can get to bring down anxiety, to help us be present and practice joy. So that's how we ended up here. If you ever find yourself starting a novel, enjoying the setting of the scene, but kind of dreading the moment when a wrench gets thrown into the works, if you like stories that aren't centered around conflict, well, you have found your people among the residents of the Village of Nothing Much. To start off, let's take a big breath in through your nose and sigh from your mouth. Do one more. Breathe in and let it out. Good. Our stories today wind through sunny spring days. We'll start with a trip into the country, a visit with someone dear and some good advice in the Asparagus Patch. Then we'll roll up our sleeves and join in on a neighborhood effort in spring cleanup. Finally, we'll let a memory lead us down a gravel drive, carry clippers into the field, and dream of ways to spread a bit of sunshine in the Tulip farm. The Asparagus Patch. The spring air was warm and sweet this morning as I drove through the hilly, bare farmlands outside of town. I was on my way to spend some time with my grandfather, who still planted a full garden each year and kept himself busy around the house, fixing broken things and reading books and making pots of vegetable soup. The trees were starting to bud out, and when you looked across the horizon, you could see that light green haze in the branches that feels like the first true sign that the winter is really over and longer, brighter days are ahead. I crested a hill, and as I did, I saw a hot air balloon floating above the line of trees. It was close and unexpected, and immediately made me smile in delight. The balloon was bright, with spiraling bands of shining fabric that rippled in the air. I could make out a few riders in its basket, and I thought of what they must be seeing today. The orange-pink morning sky, the neat patchwork squares of the fields, the budding trees and moving cars, all from a new and unusual perspective. Have you ever had a memory that you aren't sure is real? Perhaps it was a dream, except it feels lived in a way that dreams do not. As I watched that balloon rising in the sky in front of me, I was visited by a memory so strong and clear that it seemed to me it must have been real. I'd been sitting on a cliff on a high hill or mountain, and the air around me was full of hot air balloons. Some were close and clear and vibrant, and others were tiny spots in the distance and hard to make out. There were a dozen, or maybe more, and I just sat and watched them moving through the open air. I remembered thinking that if a rope were hanging from one of the baskets, it might brush past me. I could just grab it and be pulled away on some adventure. The more I thought of it, though it felt quite real, I guessed it must be the memory of a dream or a story I'd heard. I couldn't think where I could have been that such a thing would have happened, or when, or any specific detail around it. The road curved and I lost sight of the balloon, though I kept thinking of dreams masquerading as memories. As a child, I'd been sure that I'd found a secret cavern in a rocky outcropping by the beach. It was a crack in a wall of stone that I could slip through, and inside I'd found an expanse of space full of shimmering rocks and waterfalls and shallow lakes. There were stalactites and stalagmites, some of them meeting in tapered points in the middle, and I'd run my hand over their sides, which were bumpy and somehow smooth at the same time. It smelled like salty seawater and humid summer air, and I was sure somewhere around me there was certain to be a treasure chest waiting to be found. I think I'd kept this memory far in the back of my mind, knowing that it just wouldn't stand up to much grown-up scrutiny. After all, the lakes we'd visited when I was growing up weren't rimmed with rocky cliff faces. They'd been sandy or edged with leafy trees, and they were filled with fresh water, not salt. I suppose I hadn't wanted to admit that it was all a story, so I'd left the memory dusty and unexamined in the attic of my mind for years. I guess it is a mark of growing older that I don't mind so much now, knowing that these very vibrant and seemingly real scraps of memory are very likely fiction. When I was young, they seemed proof of something extraordinary and magical that existed in the world, and I fiercely wanted them to be real. But now, ordinary things seemed more magical to me than the fantasies of flying or discovering long-forgotten treasure. I thought of my grandfather, turning a piece of burl wood into a bowl in his workshop, sanding and carving and smoothing till it was ready to hold the yellow-green apples that fell from his trees. I thought of the tree that had grown that burl, the knot of twisted wood that had formed around an injury or infection, but produced a beautiful swirl in the grain. People were the same at times. producing something beautiful from a time of difficulty. This seemed magical enough for me. The road under my tires had changed to dirt, and soon I was pulling my car up in front of my grandfather's house. It was a small place, but big enough for him, and with a yard and garden many times the footprint of the home. I found him gathering small branches and fallen twigs in the grassy space behind his apple trees. After giving him a kiss on his soft, wrinkled cheek, I bent and began picking up the kindling as well. He had a shed filled with seasoned wood for his fires in the winter, and we could add all of this to his stores. We talked as we worked, and I saw him struggling a bit with the arthritis that was part of his daily life. His joints didn't want to bend and straighten as much as he wanted them to, but he was a very patient man, and we just went slower and chatted to pass the time. He plucked up a horse chestnut from the ground and passed it to me, saying, "Here, if you carry a horse chestnut in your pocket, an elephant will never step on your foot." Who was I to argue with such wise advice? When we'd gathered all the sticks and stored them away in his shed, we stopped to stand by the bare patch of dirt where he would grow his vegetables, and he pointed out where the rows of corn and green beans would go. He was always trying something new in his garden, and he had packets of seeds to show me inside. I brought some bagels from the bakery for our mid-morning snack, and we turned toward the house to go in. He stopped and pointed to a wide trench of dirt with a few green crowns poking through. It was a new asparagus patch, his old one having finally given out the year before. "Well done," I told him. "When can you harvest?" "Oh, in about 3 years," he said, and gave me a wink. I watched him walk into his house, and I slid my hand into my pocket and felt the chestnut he'd given me. This, I thought to myself, isn't a dream. This is what is happening now. Remember it. Spring cleanup. I'd first heard about it when I noticed a flyer tacked up on a telephone pole on the corner. A simple invitation to all neighbors on the block to join in on a day-long cleanup effort. We were asked to bring a stack of lawn bags, some good strong shears or snippers, and a pair of gloves. We'd meet on Saturday morning by the Triangle, which is just a bare green space at a fork in the road, and decide where to start. Well, once word got around, things started to get a bit more elaborate. If we were going to clean up, gather litter and rake old leaves, wouldn't it be nice to also plant a few flowers? The Triangle, for example. What if somebody brought over a rototiller and turned some of that blank green space into a flower bed? And there were a few homes on our block where folks needed help, cleaning off front porches, hanging out the bird feeders, and taking down storm windows. They were small chores that could be done in a jiffy if there were a few extra hands to share the work, but might just not get done at all without it. Could we organize some teams for that? And now that it looked like we'd have a full day of work, we'd need some food. Snacks through the day, maybe a potluck supper or a pizza party at the end of it that we could all share. Phone calls were made, meetings held over fences, and then a full plan laid out in new flyers, again tacked onto telephone poles and tucked through letter boxes. There were categories of needs, such as flats of flowers, spare tools, and snacks and drinks. There was a way to signal if you needed help with something around the house, and a place to indicate if you could offer some assistance. You could sign up for various locations and times, and I was glad that all I had to do was tick a few boxes and let those with a passion for organizing do the rest. The day of the cleanup dawned bright and warm. We'd pushed the whole thing back a time or two, waiting for a full week of temps in the 50s or higher so that we could give pollinators time to move out of their winter digs in stems and leaf piles. And now we'd had a week of sunny, warm days. Today would be a bit over 60 with no rain in the forecast. I was up early. It's strange what you get excited about as you get older. I couldn't wait to get out there, to start pulling weeds and gathering rubbish and meet more of my neighbors. I'd made a couple dozen brownies the night before, as one of the tasks I'd signed up for was snack table. I'd made some with walnuts and some without, and they were cut into little 3-bite squares and in a big old-fashioned Tupperware I'd gotten handed down from my mother. Do you remember the old Tupperware containers? I had the big rectangular box, which in my memory had been red, but when I'd gotten it out from the back of the cupboard, I realized was actually a classic 70s burnt orange. I'm pretty sure I'd taken a few years' worth of birthday cups to school in this solid piece of Americana, and now it held enough brownies to keep the whole block supplied. I'd also gotten a mustard yellow iced tea pitcher, the one with the lid that had the button on top to suction it into place. It had certainly held plenty of Kool-Aid in its years, but I'd figured I'd go with something a little more grown-up, and made a water infused with strawberries, basil, and lemon. When I heard front doors and front gates opening and swinging shut up and down the street, I gathered my goodies and tools and set them gently in my red flyer wagon and pulled it down the driveway and toward the triangle. We were still meeting there, where we could set up the snacks and break into groups. As I got closer, I saw that we had an excellent turnout. It looked like nearly the whole neighborhood was there. When I got to chit-chat with a few people I knew by sight, learn their names, and hand out a few sneaky brownies while we waited to be told how to begin. Finally, we heard a voice calling for quiet, and we hushed up and listened to one of our organizers. She called out various groups and pointed where to head, and off we went. I left my snack contributions on a long folding table under a canvas canopy and pulled my wagon to where I'd be working. I'd volunteered to rake and clean out an empty lot at the end of the street, and had brought a long rake, a hand trowel, and plenty of yard bags. The birds were singing above us as we shook out the bags and got to work. The smell of spring is already so energizing, but when you start to work in the dirt, it gets even better. There was that fresh scent of rain-soaked soil that rose up as we raked through the grass and leaves. We found a few soda cans and paper scraps and other sundry bits of refuse, which I offered to take back to my place to recycle. I was glad I'd brought my wagon. Soon the lot looked much less abandoned, much more friendly and clean, and one of our neighbors walked by with a few full bird feeders hanging from his fingers. He'd made them over the winter in his workshop, and since no one was using this lot for the moment, what did we think about hanging them in the trees? We thought it was a great idea, and we hung them on long wires and made a plan to fill them through the summer. Across the street, the storm windows were coming down off a beautiful old farmhouse. I knew the man who lived there. He was older and had trouble getting out. I sometimes brought him a few groceries when he let me know what he needed, and I realized the windows hadn't come down in a few years. If we hadn't asked to help today, they certainly would have stayed put another year. I watched my neighbors carefully sliding the glass panels off the hooks and carrying them around to store in the garage. Someone was sweeping his broad front porch and checking that the chains holding his swing were sturdily attached. At noon, someone rang a bell from the triangle, and we all took a break, washing our hands at a spigot in someone's yard and eating sandwiches from paper plates. The air was warm and smelled fresh with all the dirt we'd turned over. The sun was shining down on us, and we had the rest of the afternoon to take care of each other and the space we shared. Spring was here. The Tulip Farm. out past the apple orchards and cider mills, where we went to get lost in corn mazes and buy paper bags full of fresh, hot donuts in the crisp days of autumn, was a tulip farm. It was something I'd driven past 100 times without realizing what it was. Then today, I'd seen a hand-painted sign of a red tulip on a yellow background with an arrow pointing the way. The sign said they were open to the public and folks could come and pick their own. The red tulip had reminded me suddenly of a day a dozen years before. It had been the first day of May, and I'd opened my front door to find a simple wicker basket hanging from the outside knob. It was overflowing with bright red tulips and foil-wrapped sweets and tiny, delicate stems of lilies of the valley. I remember lifting the basket right up to my face to smell the good, sweet scent of the flowers, then wondering how and why they'd been picked for me. It had taken me a day to unwind the mystery. I carried everything back inside and rooted through my cabinets for a bunch of tiny jars and bud vases. I put each flower in its own container to make them go as far as possible, then spread them out through the house on windowsills and side tables and a teeny ledge in the hall that seemed to have been built just for this. I went back to the basket and carefully gathered all the candies and slid them into my jacket pocket, then stepped back out the front door and off down the street. I don't remember now where I'd been going. Maybe I'd had a class to take or a shift to work at the deli downtown, but along the way, every now and then I'd slip a candy from my pocket, unwrap it, and drop it into my mouth. There were some wrapped to look like strawberries, and I remembered that my grandmother had always had the same ones on a shelf in her living room. I'd laughed when I'd tasted the familiar flavor, remembering sneaking into that room to peruse the little collection of sweets in cut glass jars. It was the kind of sitting room no one actually sat in, and that meant that there were always interesting things to find in the drawers and cupboards. I used to take a few candies from the jars, pull down a heavy book with pictures of butterflies and birds and animals from all over the world, and tuck myself into the space behind the couch to slowly turn the pages until the sweets ran out. Wherever I'd been off to that day, I must have run into friends and soon found out I wasn't the only one to have been visited by the spring fairy overnight. 3 or 4 of us had found baskets, all with flowers and candy, and we'd spent some time on a park bench in the sunshine trying to guess who our benefactor was. Finally, we'd spotted another friend coming toward us down the path, and we'd called out asking if she'd found a surprise on her doorstep. "No," she shrugged. "I was busy leaving them for all of you." May Day, she told us, was sometimes celebrated this way, with gifts of spring flowers and candies or baked goods. Thinking back on that May Day, the kindness of a gift given when no one was looking, and the memories that the sweets had brought back, it made me turn into the gravel lot at the tulip farm. Stepping out of my car, I was greeted by the lilting call of the song sparrow, a bird whose return, along with that of the red-winged blackbird and the orange-breasted housefinch, marked the arrival of spring. The sky was a soft pale blue, with a few feathery clouds shifting with the breeze. Tulips don't have a strong smell. They aren't like those lilies of the valley or hyacinth that smell so powerfully like sweet water and greenery, but still there was a light scent in the air, like citrus and honey and cut grass. I followed a dirt trail toward the fields, glad I'd worn sturdy shoes instead of flip-flops. And as it turned to pass behind a barn, the tulip fields came into view. I thought I'd been ready for that, and I wasn't. Actual goosebumps stood out on my arms, and I stopped, stock still, to give all my attention to what I was seeing. stretched out for acres in front of me, in broad, flat, even rectangles were bright patches in 50 colors or more. Like a panoramic picture, I turned my head to see the farthest field to the left, then slowly scanned all the way to the right, and marveled that tulips could come in so many shades. When I'd had my fill of looking and began to walk again, I spotted a man in dusty overalls with a broad-brimmed hat. He waved me over, and as I got closer, he said, "I like watching people's faces as they first see the fields. Have you been here before?" I told him I hadn't and felt lucky to be. He fitted me out with a pair of gloves, some small garden shears, and a long, deep basket I could carry over one arm. He gave me a folded paper map with the names of the different varieties of flowers and their locations, then sent me off to gather as many as I was inclined to cut. I thought I might just wander and be led by my eyes and instincts, but looking at the card, I found some of the names so intriguing that I decided to aim for some specific plots. Some were classic in shape and color, called things like Christmas Marvel or Ruby Red or Diana. Others were streaked with color in bold lines that looked like brushstrokes. There were Rembrandts and Davenports and Marilyns. Some had double blossoms, or fringed petals, or very thin veins of color that you could only see when you leaned down close. Into my basket went stems of the Queen of the Night, Golden Appledorn, and Dreamland. I picked enough for a few May Day baskets and to fill my own vase at home. Before I walked back to the barn to pay for my flowers and turn over my tools, I stopped and sat on a bench under a tall sycamore tree whose leaves were just budding out, so that the branches looked coated in a light green fuzz. I thought of the baskets I would put together with my tulips, of stopping at the candy store across from the movie theater and filling a bag with sweet pinwheels and tart lemon drops and strawberry bonbons. I'd sneak out early tomorrow morning and leave them at a few front doors. I thought that their faces, when they found them, might look something like mine did when I'd first seen the tulip fields. Surprise! It's spring. Thank you for visiting with us here in the village of Nothing Much. Let's celebrate the small moments of our lives this week. After all, your life is made up almost entirely of small moments. And if each of them can mean just a bit more, deliver a bit more connection, joy, understanding, then that is a different life.